Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so with today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on starting our personal finance unit. So most of our economics that we're going to talk about is going to be focusing on personal finance. So our previous lessons are really kind of just giving you some background in basics of the American economy, how it works, how it functions. But really, like, our focus is going to be like financial decision making and financial advice that's going to help you once you graduate high school, once you graduate college, things that you have to be thinking about, things that you're going to have to know in order to survive and thrive as as a worker and a citizen within the country. So today we're going to be focusing on saving and like why it's important to save and the different formats of saving that you have to really kind of understand. So the first thing that we're going to be taking a look at, I want you guys to take a look at this quote. So if a company is not expanding, it is contracting. So businesses kind of live by this idea, they live by this quote, and I think you have to kind of look into this to actually understand it. What do they mean by this? Because the same is true with your money. If your money is not expanding, it's actually contracting. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is why? Why is that true in business? For a business, if they're not expanding, they're actually contracting. Why is that true for you with your money? If it's not expanding, it's actually contracting. And the answer is controlled inflation. So when you look at our country, we have an organization that is not really technically a part of the federal government, but it was created by the federal government called the Fed. And the Fed, one of the things that they do is they control the expansion and the contraction of our money supply. In other words, they kind of control inflation rates within the country, loan rates within the country. And so one of the things that the Fed does is they kind of control inflation. And so by design, they create about 2 to 3% inflation every single year within the country. That's considered like a normal inflationary rate within the nation. So I want you guys to think about that. If there's inflation of 2 to 3% every single year, what does that mean for your money? What does that mean for you and your salary that you're making in any given job? Essentially, inflation means that your money is losing value of about 2 to 3% every single year. Now, that's very important because in 1 year or 2 years, that might not mean that much, but over 10 or 15 or 20 years, what that means is that the purchasing power that you have with that money that you've put into, let's say, a savings account or you've put away somewhere, it's losing its value. And that's very important to understand because if you're trying to plan for saving for long-term saving, for your retirement, for big purchases that you want to make, essentially, if you're not going to be using that money for 20, 30 years, you can't just have it sitting in an account or even worse, sitting in your house somewhere because essentially that money that you earned is losing value. And by 20, 30 years, it's lost like half of its purchasing power value. So this is a very important principle to understand, this principle of inflation, this principle of the fact that we have controlled inflation built into our economy every single year. Now, first thing you have to kind of understand, we're going to go through is reasons why you might save. So the first thing, I think, scary statistic. If you look at this here, this is showing you Americans and how much savings that they have. The average American, well, I'm going to say the average American, but a large percentage of Americans, I think it's somewhere almost 50% or over 50%, essentially they have no savings. You have 21% of people who don't have a savings account at all. You have 28% of Americans who have nothing in their savings account. They have it, but they have nothing in it. Then you have 9% who have the minimum balance. So if you add that up, that's coming out to over 50% of Americans essentially have no savings at all. And so we don't want to be in that category when we're kind of being smart planning for the future. And it's difficult to save money because there's always an expense that's coming up. So what we're going to try and figure out are ways that you can do it so that you kind of don't have the temptation, or you can't have the temptation to actually use that money for something else that might come up. So first thing, why do we want to save? We're going to kind of throw it into a couple big different categories. So the first one we're going to throw out there is saving for a short-term purchase. So like this, the one at the end here, a house is not a short-term purchase. That's a long-term purchase. But like some shorter-term purchases, things that you might want to spend it on, right? Let's say, for example, like you want to go on a vacation, or you want to purchase like, let's say like some books for school. those are kind of like more short term, on the short term side of purchases, things that are going to be, you're going to be able to purchase within 6 months, a year, maybe a year and a half. Those are things that I would kind of consider short term purchases. So those are kind of things you want to have savings for, some short term purchases, things that are not super long term, but that you might want to purchase kind of in the immediate future. Okay, so you don't have the money on hand yet, but you know that this is a goal that you want to have, that you want to be able to purchase these different things. Okay, so that's first type of saving that you want to have. Second type of savings is long-term purchases. So a long-term purchase might be, you know that you want to buy a house, 10 years from now. That's a long-term purchase that you're going to potentially save for. You know that you want to buy a car, you want to lease a car, but you don't have enough money for it. That's a long-term purchase. So these are things that are going to take, over a year in order for you to save for it, actually be able to purchase this. They could be up to 5, 6, 7 years. It depends on how long it's going to take for you to save the amount of money that you might need. But these are longer term purchases that you might want to make. So that's another reason to save, long-term purchases. Another big reason to save is for emergencies. This is huge, right? Things always come up, right? So like if you're maintaining things, like for example, I always think like I always save some money just in case something comes up with my car. Who knows? Problems happen with your car. You might have to pay for it. You might have to, get massive, you might get in an accident that you have to pay for out of pocket. Things are going to come up that potentially you might need money for. People might get sick in your family that you have to pay things for. An accident might happen. All these different things potentially could occur that you're going to have to potentially pay for. And if you don't have savings, what ends up happening is people end up going into debt for these types of things, right? So let's say an accident might happen. You don't necessarily have the money to pay for something like that. You might have to go into debt to pay that bill. And so essentially you want to have savings set aside to pay for emergencies. Last big thing that you want to have a savings system for is retirement. So this statistic is again scary. So millennials are the people who are really kind of like in their, I would say like mid-20s now to about like 40 or somewhere in that ballpark, like late 30s. And so essentially 42% of millennials have nothing saved for retirement. That's a horrible position to be in. So you don't want to kind of fall into that trap. It's easy to kind of put it off because it's seen as such a distant thing, especially when you start to work, when you're 18, 19 years old, 20 years old, and you're just getting your first jobs. You're not really thinking about what's life going to be like when I'm 55, when I'm 60, when I'm 65. But if you do start thinking about it early, it can save you tremendously over time, and it's a very intelligent thing to do, to start to save for your retirement as soon as you start to get like your first full-time job and you start to work a little bit. So what I'm going to try and do with the rest of the screencast is kind of give you some advice as to like ways that you can save in these different areas. I won't be able to go to as much detail as I would kind of like in our live classes, but I'm going to try my best to kind of go through all these different ways to save. So first thing we're going to talk about are potential ways to save in more of a short-term fashion. So some of them you may be familiar with, but others you may not. So like the one thing that we always, I think about in savings is saving with a savings account. So this is a good way to save for like short-term purchases, okay? When you think about savings, the things that you have to think about is something that we're going to call being able to access the money. So the liquidity of the money. Can you actually get this money out, and how quickly can you get this money out? So that's one big thing you want to think about with savings account or any kind of savings. And then two, the other big thing you want to think about is how much is this money growing over time, right? The interest rate available on the money. So like those are the two things, what's called the liquidity of it, like how easily can I access this? How easily can I take this money out? And then how much is this potential money that I put away somewhere growing? Now, those two things are very important, right? The liquidity of it, especially with short-term purchases, you want to be able to access that emergency situation savings. You want to be able to access that as easily, as quickly as possible. And you don't want any penalties for having to access that money like, the next day. The other thing is interest rate, right? Because that's telling you how much your money is going to grow. And that can be compounded daily. That can be compounded monthly. It can be compounded every, biannually. It depends on the account, so you have to look into that different type of interest rate and how it's compounded. But essentially, those two things matter. Now, savings account, the best thing about a savings account is its liquidity. You can access a savings account basically whenever you want. You can move that over into a checking account. I have my savings account linked to my checking account, so I can move my money from my savings account anytime into my checking account. Essentially, that's the best thing about it. The thing that's not so great about it is essentially that these are the best interest rates you're going to find out there, and it just so happens that all the best savings account interest rates are on online savings accounts. Your brick and mortar banks really don't offer the best interest rates anymore on their savings account. It's way, way less than this. So we're talking about below 1%. And the problem with these interest rates, is that it's not keeping up with the rate of inflation. So it's not a good format to really save and try and invest in a long-term fashion. Okay. Second type of savings, which you could use for short-term purchases, or you could use for a little bit longer-term purchases, is something called a CD, or a certificate of deposit. Now, this is good. Basically, you have to look into the terms of a CD and how it works. But essentially, it has a little bit less liquidity than a savings account. So essentially, you put money into this special type of account called a certificate of deposit, or abbreviated as CD. And when you put money into that account, you're basically kind of like loaning the bank some money, and you're kind of you're going to sign like a contract that goes along with it. Now, CDs can last for 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, even longer than that. So it's up to you, like the length of term of it. So once you put that money into it, it has very limited liquidity. It's very difficult to take it out, and if you do take it out, you have to pay a lot of penalties for taking it out. So essentially, when you put money into this, you can't really access it whenever you want. So this is good for a purchase you're going to be making, let's say, like down the line, like a year from now, 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, because you don't need to touch that money. It's not for emergencies. It's not for a short-term purchase. It's for a short-term purchase or a long-term purchase that's going to take some time. So it's not very liquid, the money. But the reason that people would put their money in a CD or a certificate of deposit is that it gets a higher interest rate. And the longer the CD lasts for, let's say one that lasts for a year or 2 years, the higher the interest rate might be. So you have to kind of research this and kind of look into it, but it's a good way to save, and it's a good way to kind of have your money grow. The downside is you can't access it as easily. All right, now we're going to try and quickly talk a little bit about retirement. So I might not get a chance to kind of finish this, and I feel like I probably won't, so I'll have to make maybe like another short video that kind of goes along with this. So actually, I think I'm just going to kind of stop it here. I don't want to rush. I want to go through it and kind of clarify it well for you guys. But saving for retirement is another kind of like huge aspect. So we'll kind of tackle this in a screencast that I'm going to attach to this. And you guys can kind of like watch it in addition to watching this one.